Tom, if I may start with you. When we were chatting in the green room a moment ago, you said something striking. You said the workplace is dysfunctional. I wanted you to explain what you mean by this. Do you think all workplaces are dysfunctional or just mine at The Economist? We didn't have a chance to dig into this. Tell us a little bit about what you find in your work that you think is dysfunctional and how much of it, to connect it back to the arc of today. And I'm going to get to our poll question in a moment.
Right.
Because the answer from our last poll actually connects a bit to the topic of this session, but since that was so striking, I wanted to give you the microphone first.
Sure. So, hey, it's not all dysfunctional, so I don't think it's doom and gloom. But hey, I think a lot of our clients say, a lot of companies are really trying to reinvent their workforce and begin to say, how do I work with these digital natives and make my talent more relevant for the future? So as you begin to mix different sort of generations and talent that have different capabilities, and we talked about earlier breaking down silos, it's bringing individuals together who speak very different languages. So you think about bringing a real sharp technologist and bringing a lot of business experts, and you marry in a bunch of designers, and you put them in a room together, you should just watch them. Watch them work. I mean, just sit behind a mirror and watch them work for a couple hours, and you realize they're all speaking a different language with zero translation. So in my mind, what we're seeing a fair bit of is this dysfunction of how organizations can actually harness the power of this new breed of employee that understands digital technologies and how to take it into the workplace against the backdrop of a legacy workforce who doesn't understand what it means to work agile, doesn't understand design thinking, doesn't understand how you drive business results from it. So you mix that all together, some exciting things can happen, but you're gonna have a period of a little bit of dysfunction unless you get the teams understanding how one and the other actually communicate and what they mean by different words.
It's a great way to frame what we're going to talk about. In some ways, I think the room here is already with you. If I can remind us of the opening poll question we did this morning, I had asked, as traditional industries undergo digital disruption, what would you say is the key factor in determining who wins or loses, right? That was the polling question. And we have had CEOs on this stage and chief executives in the room. That was one of the options. Strategy, we have a strategy expert in the back of the room. I know a professor and others are strategic thinkers. That was an option. But in fact, the winning answer was a competitive and tech-savvy workforce. That's what you chose. And so in a sense, that gets to a little bit of how do we unleash the potential, the power of this workforce. That's a challenge, of course, for your strategy, for your software systems, and ultimately for the C-suite. Let's go to our second question, which we're going to use the app once again. This is our polling questions, thanks to PwC for sponsoring it. How can incumbents resist attacks on their business from firms that have been built on digital mastery from the start? First answer, they can't. Give up now, go home. Or actually, don't give up, but go and buy one of these guys, right? That's how you do it. Find a way to transform your company. Think and act like a digital startup from within. And the third is really the give up and go home. The challenges are the future, and the incumbents are toast. So please put in your answers into the app. We appreciate you giving your feedback. We'll come back to the answers at the end of the session. So if I can, maybe I'll turn next to Vanessa. Vanessa, you're a veteran both of an institution that is, I think, 2 centuries old, if I'm not mistaken, yep. Right? And so making not only The Economist, but GE and others who are centenarians seem young. But at the same
You're not toast yet.
Yeah, not yet. We're oddly enough, we were founded at a time when the world was turning against trade and globalization. And indeed, The Economist was founded to make the case for globalization, open markets, and free trade, and the benefits this will bring to the world. And yet, here we are again today, how the wheel turns around, right? We feel we're as relevant as we did in 1843. But your other hat, while being part of this great institution with very long-lived, which involves often doing some of the same things that people expect the same way. Like if I want money to be sent through your payment system, I don't want too much experimentation or innovation. I want it to be done exactly the same way you did it yesterday, efficiently and correctly. But you're, at Citi Ventures, you're obviously looking for the next new thing, a very different kind of culture. Can you tell us what it's like to be heading up that effort in a company which has proven through its longevity that it also has a certain kind of traditionalism or conservatism?
Sure, and thanks for having me this morning. I think, when we think about how do you marry the merits of the digital culture and all that's new and fast and agile with the assets and the capabilities and the expertise of a very old firm, we really think about it in the context of what we call productive collisions. So it's not enough, we don't think, to just put people together or put people in an interesting situation and see what happens, right? You've got to design some systems to say, how do we bring in new thinking? How do we bring in fundamental questioning of what if we did it this way? What if we learned about it that way? But in a context where, to your point, it's important that, on the main of what we do, there's a lot that doesn't need experimentation. We were joking before we came up in the panel. Someone said to me last week, it's a little bit like you're being wheeled in for an operation, right? You're on the gurney. It's not the time that you want your surgeon to say, I was thinking of trying something new today. Right? You want some of these things to function in a very low variability, very certain fashion. Having said that, there's so much dislocation in the world right now. There's so much new opportunity as we think about whether it's IoT and what the digital payment systems will need to look like on top of that, or how does that impact trade finance? There's a lot going on. And so what we've found at Citi is that it's critical to have not just different kinds of people working together, but to create what we think of as engines, like I said, that foster these productive collisions, so that what you end up with is a way to move forward that incorporates a lot of what's new, but does it with a true understanding of what the complexity and what the risk environment is that you work on. And I think for us, I'm sure you guys have views on this as well, but for us, the cornerstone of that is how do we get much deeper in terms of client validation? How do we ensure that where we're looking first to understand where things need to go is outside the institution, not inside? And if there's something, having spent almost 20 years in Silicon Valley, that new companies do extraordinarily well, is they base their ethos on what is it that the market is looking for from us, right? Because as great a culture as you have, you've got to build it against delivering something that the market wants. And I think oftentimes over time, incumbents start to believe that they understand what the market wants. And what we find is in a marketplace that moves as quickly as it does today, you've got to go back to your roots and build those engines that pull in from the outside what the market wants and use that in a way as a setting for the kind of dialogue that Tom was talking about earlier.
Is there any example of a product, a service, or a venture that you have been able to develop that went against traditional culture at the company?
Oh, for sure. That's what we try and do all the time. I mean, traditional culture, I think culture is an interesting thing, and I know we're going to get into that. There's always a debate, is culture top-down or bottoms-up, and we think about it as eating a sandwich. It's really great to eat a sandwich that has a bun on the bottom and on the top because it's not so messy. It's possible to eat an open-faced sandwich. It's impossible to eat a top-faced sandwich because the whole thing just falls apart. Right? So when you think about culture, it's great to have top-down, but it's critically imperative to have bottoms-up, right, embedded in the business. And so I don't think of what we do as much as countercultural or changing or flying in the face of the culture. It's more, how do we particularly focus on the businesses, but how do we build that sandwich in a way that continues to evolve the culture? Because the culture that was really effective 10 years ago or 30 years ago or 50 years ago is not going to be effective 10 years from now. And so it's more evolution than it is sort of flying in the face of, right? It's a lot more collaborative.
Okay, so we've heard that a lot of companies are dysfunctional. We've heard about the value of having sandwiches. Justin, you think a lot about culture, teamwork. Your current company is very much involved in helping people work together. And why do you think some cultures, company cultures, fail? And can we learn anything about what helps companies evolve or succeed over time?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that companies treat culture as something that's just going to emergently happen in a positive direction and just assume it'll just turn out for the best. we really think that that's about as naive as thinking that if you just throw a bunch of product people in a room that it's going to turn out well. We think of culture as a product, as just like another one of these things that you need to carefully design, think through, implement with top-down and bottoms-up components, but something that you need to carefully think about and then constantly be monitoring and checking to see whether things are actually going well. A huge part of that, for example, is that the vast majority of cultures seem to lack even really basic things like clarity about who is doing what by when, right? We talk about the sort of 3 key clarities you want to have as clarity of purpose, clarity of plan, and clarity of responsibility, meaning like you want the entire team to have a very clear understanding of the purpose. Why are we doing this in the first place? A clear understanding of what are all the steps left between now and accomplishing any one of our goals, and clarity of responsibility, who's responsible for what by when. And these seem like super basic things that any organization should have. You would think like it wouldn't even be possible to do anything without having those basic understandings. And yet I think that the vast majority of companies are in that state where they don't have that information, and people spend huge amounts of time just on like not doing their job, not doing work, but doing work about work. Spending time just like figuring out who has the ball on this, making sure the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. And so we spent a ton of time thinking at a cultural level about how to make sure that people have those basic understandings, have that real clarity. And then Asana as a piece of software was started because we found previously I'd worked at Facebook and at Google, and even at those companies that had great cultures, there was still tons of time spent on that kind of work about work. And so Asana is a piece of software that at this point many companies have brought in to 20,000 customers have brought in to help them to get that kind of basic clarity. And we just find that, I can talk more about other parts of culture, but in general, that attention to culture and taking the time, if people don't do it, there's entropy where actually culture gets worse and worse over time. And for us, we've experienced that having that real solid foundation of culture has been a huge asset. It's been something that allows us to innovate more quickly, allows us to just move much faster with a smaller team, allows us to retain great talent and recruit great talent because super talented people want to come work for a great culture. We actually just think of culture as one of our greatest business assets in a way that I think most companies that end up having cultures that fail think of it as this nice-to-have secondary thing.
That sounds great, but let me challenge you, and this
Please.
is a challenge for all of our panelists, that there are trade-offs, that a very pleasing set of values that are put forth from the top and kumbaya sessions from the bottom up to bring in people's values. That's one way to go, but in what we see in finance, your industry, in tech, I mean, we can look at some of the challenges Uber is having at the moment with its culture, that there is often a tension between high performance culture, that is producing results, be that quarterly or some other metrics that meet the business needs in the short term, and something more enduring. How do you resolve this tension that we can see in lots of organizations? Because that also is a product of culture, right?
Yeah, I actually think.
Is it that they didn't think about it, or is it that they made a choice that something is more important, that is, let's say, financial metrics or something else?
So I've had the pleasure of working, as I said, at Google and at Facebook, which are companies that prove that, I think people think of it as that there's this tension. You're either optimizing for ruthlessness and quarterly results and getting the best on the bottom line, or you're optimizing for some touchy-feely, everyone feels happy, but then we're never actually going to make any money. And I think that's just totally a myth, and that in actuality, the companies that have bad cultures and are succeeding in spite of their bad culture, not because of that bad culture. And you can create something that has that takes a lot of these things we see as we see as contradictions, and instead just have them simultaneously be the case. For example, people often think that there's this contrast between either you're extremely hardworking and stressed out, because you're so focused on getting to the results. When you don't achieve those results, everyone panics. Or you have a culture that's very relaxed, very laid back, and everyone's quite lazy. And you have this linear spectrum where you have to choose between them. We think that's just completely a false dichotomy. That you can actually, we talk about it in terms of equanimity, that you can be extremely passionate about the result that you're going for, but also maintain a kind of meditative mindfulness of realizing that if it doesn't work out, there's other things we can do. We can learn from our mistakes. We can reflect on them calmly. We can incorporate the results of those learnings and try again. And all the research, and I think all of at least my experience shows that time spent on stressing out, yelling at each other, blaming each other is totally wasted versus time that you could take allocating that toward figuring out, okay, what can we take as a mindful set of next steps to actually improve performance?
I agree with that a lot, and I think when we look at sort of Silicon Valley and what happens there and what is there to be learned from some of these companies, I think there's a lot of mythology around what the culture is, like it's free food and bicycles and foosball tables. And what you find in these companies is, we always talk about it as, these people are masters of discovery, right? They're curious, they're engaged, they're passionate, and they are also fanatics about execution. And those two things are not in opposition to one another, right? They live together. So then the question for an incumbent becomes, how do you foster that kind of culture of curiosity, of multiple perspectives, of not having a fear of failure, especially in a place where volatility isn't prized? Right? How do you bring those things together so that you get not this notion of, well, we're either all just hanging out eating free food or we're making quarterly results, but you can be a master of discovery and a fanatic about execution and propel your company forward. And I think that's where learning from not just the surface view of what happens in these companies, but underneath what really makes them tick, and how do you take that kind of optimism and curiosity and say, you know what, a lot of what happens in a big company is that failure isn't embraced because it starts getting talked about as sort of catastrophic failure. No one wants to embrace catastrophic failure. Doesn't matter if you're in a tech company or you're any place like that, that's not the point. The point is, how do you create a culture where it's about learning? And if you invalidate a hypothesis, I mean, I come from a science background, right? That's just as valuable as if you validate it, right? Whatever it is, it allows you to move forward in some way. And I think if you can grab those threads that Justin's talking about and really bring those in, then that's something that lets you see that these things aren't in opposition. They're really together. It's just that you've got to rekindle a little bit of the curiosity and the optimism.
So let's pick up on the powerful point you made. This is the second panel that I've been on stage here where people have talked about the role of failure, right? And it's one of the truisms of management gurus that they tell companies, you need to fail fast. You need to, actually, let's have a straw poll. How many of you have heard, that if you want to be innovative, you need to fail more often, fail fast, learn from your failures, right? Most people have heard this. Oh, right, keep your hands up. How many of you have all your failures at the top of your LinkedIn page? Right. So it's very hard for type A personalities, which I'm sure we all are, people who want to succeed, to acknowledge the value of learning from our experiences, from our failures, in part because the companies we work at, they don't really value it that much. They'd much rather you succeeded, right? So how do we overcome that problem? Examples of companies that do it well, that reduce the penalties or even celebrate some of their learnings. And in particular, you talked about science. So you have she has a very distinguished background in science before she entered into her current field. The science, we wrote a cover story a couple of years ago, among other things, pointing out that scientific journals rarely publish. There's a bias towards successful cases, right? Things that we learned, drugs that do work in trials. Pharma companies notoriously don't share any information about the stuff that doesn't work. So there's a huge inefficiency, one could argue, in the progress that we're making on successful drugs because no company wants to share the failures with others for proprietary reasons. And so there's we could imagine, if that's just one small slice, science, in corporate America, there would be even stronger reasons not to do this. So what are things that do work in overcoming this known problem?
I have a quick one, and I bet Tom has some examples. To me, what we try and instill is separating the idea from the person. I think what corporate America does a lot is you just become your idea. So then, heaven forbid, if your idea fails, then you must have been foolish or not known. At the pace of change that we have today, it's impossible to know all of the answers. Anyone who tells you they know all the answers is not saying the truth. So you've got to get to a place where you can separate the idea from the person. And then, if every single idea the person has over a period of time fails, then you can make some conclusions from that. But I think that separation is really critical.
I was going to say, it's interesting, for the last 10 years, Vijay, we've been doing this sort of digital IQ study. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a twofold increase in that CEOs are owning the agenda for all things digital innovation, right? It used to be around 30%, now it's 60, 65%. In that same time frame, their level of confidence of what digital innovation means for their organization has dropped, right? So as soon as they take the mantle, right, they're beginning to fear themselves in that role, saying, I'm the one who's supposed to champion this cause, and now I have less confidence. When it was just the IT agenda, I was fine and comfortable. But now, since it's my agenda, I'm fearful that I will actually fail as a CEO and then be put aside. So I think when we look at incumbent organizations versus the new entrant, if you had to compare their value set and what they truly sort of push down through the organization and empower employees, they are distinctly different. And I think it does need to start from the top of giving people the freedom to do the things that are important to become the new entrant in your industry, to do something disruptive in your industry. Oftentimes we talk about, well, what is a chief digital officer? Your job is to be the chief disobedient officer, right? You're the one who's meant to sort of break rules in the organization and have the freedom to go do that. So if you're able to do that, fundamentally, you look at the cultures and values of those organizations, they have had to have changed dramatically over the last 5 years. If not, they are going to be encroached upon by somebody new, somebody different that they never saw coming.
Yeah, on failure, we literally do celebrate failure and find ways to learn from it in very systematic ways. So internally, we have every few weeks a forum called Show and Tell, where people show the entire company, here's what we've been working on as a team the last few weeks, here's what's gone well, and here's what's gone poorly. And people genuinely just get applause and get celebrated even when they did something that failed, because they'll also explain what they learned from that experience. But even publicly, something that's frustrated me a lot at other companies is, in general, when something goes badly, there's this PR instinct to just kind of soften it, cover it up. Even if you're going to kind of admit failure, make it look like it wasn't that bad. If we have a site outage or something for a few hours, we'll publish a super detailed blog post that says, here's everything that went wrong, here's all the ways in which we screwed up, and here's everything we're planning to do to fix it. And I think some people at first were like, wait, that's a little too transparent, that makes me uncomfortable. But customers' reactions has been universally positive. They're like, oh, thank you for actually being straight with me. And then a process that we have for learning from failures rather than just being vague about it, we didn't invent this, but is 5 whys, where when a major problem happens, all the people who are responsible get into a room and have this calm conversation in which there's explicitly a separation of who, we say, people don't fail, processes fail. And we look at, why did this problem happen? And then we'll say, well, why did that happen? And why did that happen? And why did that happen? And so it might start as something very mundane, like there was a small bug in the system, could end up with, we haven't onboarded our engineers well enough to understand this piece of the infrastructure. And then you can look at each of those whys that you've accumulated and take a proportionate response, say, what's something that we can do to help ensure that that particular problem doesn't happen again in the future? What's beautiful about that is that whereas a lot of companies will end up making the same failure, the same mistake over and over again, in no small part because they don't want to talk about it, it's too embarrassing. There's a fear that if we talk about it more, I'll get blamed or it'll happen again. Instead, by facing it head on, while Asana continues to have problems, we generally don't repeat the same mistake more than once or twice.
And I think one other aspect that we haven't talked about as much that goes along with every time you've heard about failure is, how do you fail fast? Right? And so, we've talked and touched on kind of the catastrophic, the site goes down, everybody gets in a room, you talk about what happened. The point is not failing catastrophically, it's how do you fail quickly, which means how do you fail small and inexpensively. So for us, what we do to do that is, we talked about it a little bit before, is how do we get outside the walls of the institution and understand what our clients and customers need before we go and put a whole lot of effort and energy and resource into building a new product or service or feature that maybe we weren't quite right about what they want. So if you go to all that trouble and then you release something to the market and the market doesn't love it, that's an embarrassing failure, right? Because you've now, as an institution, committed to something, it's gone all the way through, and then you kind of don't want to say, well, gee, maybe we shouldn't have done that. If somebody has an idea about what a client wants and wants to go explore that, and then can come back and say, hey, clients love my idea, or, they didn't really love my idea, but I'm working on my next idea. Then you get from this sort of bigger, more maybe embarrassing, more costly failure to what's really the core of failure is not the failure, to your point, it's what did you learn from it? And it's if you can amp up that learning velocity, that's what people are looking for. It's not looking for a resume of all the things that you failed about. It's looking for a resume, a culture, a company that can learn quickly enough that you're just cycling through things and getting to a better answer that much faster.
Other than the companies you actually work for or specifically consult with, are there companies you admire that do this precise thing? Who does it well?
I mean, any startup that still exists, right?
The startups haven't.
I mean, if you aren't in a process of constantly learning what's going to work and what's not going to work, then by the time you get to your next round of funding, you're going to have a really tough time.
I think this is wise. I actually want to temper it in the other direction, just because at least I've seen a lot of people.
Let me just ask, please get your questions ready. I'm going to come to audience questions shortly.
I've actually seen people start to take that advice so strongly that they're doing little tiny experiments that never have enough investment in them to actually get off the ground. This is sometimes called these small products are referred to as minimum viable products, MVPs. There's sometimes the burnt pizza MVP problem, where the metaphor is if you were trying to see if there was a market for pizza and you put together a pizza so quickly to try to fail fast that you just like cranked it up and ended up burning the pizza, you might conclude there's no market for pizza, but it's actually that you made a bad pizza. So finding the right balance between putting in, and some ideas like you could have said for search engines or something, or there are a lot of things that if you don't do it quite well, then people aren't going to like it. And figuring out exactly how much effort you need to put in order to understand whether this thing works, I think is actually quite an art.
I agree with you. I think it's just a context. We're in such different contexts, right? In our world, the danger is not going too far one direction because there's a big institution that's built up in one area, right? Mm-hmm. And I completely agree with you. It's not about only little experiments. It's about how do you de-risk what you're doing step by step so that you get to some place that actually yields fruit at the end of it.
Yeah.
Vijay, I was going to say,
something
the other thought too, I think, I know we talk a lot about culture, which is important, super important, but I think in addition to that, we have an airline, client that we're working with. They're doing some like very interesting things, truly an incumbent, right, when you think of it, and they're going at it from 3 different angles, saying, what if we could establish a whole new workplace environment? Like designed in a way that adapts to what they need to get done. If they got to work in a scrum room together, fantastic. If they got to work individually in a separate cafe area, so be it. If they got to work in an isolated room with nobody else around them, give them that flexibility. So, they approached it from set up a whole new environment, and then part 2, to your point, on set up a new process of how that team could work, and then you combine it with, actually, how do you infuse new talent into the mix? Like that 3-part formula is really working well for some of our clients because they're actually approaching from every dimension as to how an individual experiences their day, the environment, the process, and the talented individuals around them.
Right. Great. Let's go. Oh, I see. Is that a question over there? Okay, great. Let's have the lady in the corner. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Jeanette Kahidi. I'm with Clario, which is an innovation growth strategy firm. So we talk a lot about failure in startups. I think in corporate world, people fear change, but what they really fear is loss. And so there's a lot of resistance towards change. What do you think about automation in the workplace and how that's going to impact culture?
Just to be clear on the question, when you say people fear loss, do you mean losing their job or losing their budgets or their fiefdom, as it were?
Yeah, so when people say that they fear change, I think what they really mean is that they fear loss, meaning I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose responsibility over my project.
Right.
And so therefore, I think that when we talk about change in corporate, what we're really talking about is loss. And if we can start addressing that, we could probably figure out a way to create more change.
Okay, and you wanted to link it to automation there. Okay.
Automation and corporate
Sure.
culture.
Okay, who wants to take that on? Thank you for the question.
I mean, I'd use your framework on this one, which is what's the next why, right? And the next why of why you fear loss is often because you don't have any control over it. And so that's the scary part. It's like, I don't know what's going to happen to me because I don't have any control. And I think, many of the points that Tom's raised about digital natives and how do we incorporate this, a lot of the processes, whether it's around Agile or Scrum teams or getting people together in these productive collisions, it's really about giving people back the feeling that you described at your company, which is that their actions, their perspective, their contributions make a material difference. They're not just one piece of a gigantic puzzle, but they can make a material difference to what the company is offering. And I think that both changes their ability to contribute. So as you think about sort of automation of some things and the need to retrain and retool a lot of people for other kinds of contributions, but it also just changes the mindset and kind of the mental orientation around how do you feel about what's happening, because you've got some control and some ability, some agency to be a contributor to where something's going.
I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think as everyone in the room as leaders, right, of your organization, you got to look at it, I think, two ways. One, you need to drive this innovation and adopt new technologies, RPA and so forth, which sounds fantastic. But then you need to have a parallel stream saying, how are you going to reskill and retool your workforce and free them up to do the next greatest thing? And I know Jamie Miller was here earlier at GE, and she's talking about this explicitly of what she's done in her business to drive 30 to 40% productivity gains. And she said her employees are just like living it, loving it, because they do find more opportunity for themselves coming out of this next wave of change. There's definitely anxiety. I think we got to be able to face that up front and be honest about it. But I do believe the opportunity for us to reskill and retool a workforce is equally on all of our shoulders and can't be left on the shoulders of academia to go figure out.
Just to underline the question as I heard it, that kind of change where there's tremendous automation, productivity improvements, change in workflows, a change in the actual skill sets required, is very disconcerting if you're in an environment where you think you can be sacked at any moment, right? So you're not going to get the best out of your people if the change most likely means a loss of what I have today, right? So I suppose it's a challenge to leaders to show that they value, if not the old job of running the cotton gin or whatever it was that's going to be replaced with the new generation of technology, but the wisdom gained over years or an ability to learn and adapt to the new skills that are needed. I think surely it's a failure of the leadership not to convey to the followers that you are valued and here are opportunities for you and here's what you can do to prepare yourself for the future and we'll help you.
Right.
I assume that must be part of the answer.
I think it has to be. There's a couple of great organizations that have come out publicly and said, hey, our workforce needs to transform itself, and they're going to have to do it a little bit on their dime and a little bit on their time, to be realistic. And that's the only way this is going to work. I don't think any one of us can come out there and say we're going to put all of our employees through a 6-month boot camp to get them retooled on every new emerging technology and every new way of applying design thinking and so forth. It's just not practical. So I think it's going to be incumbent upon leaders as well as employees to say, I'm willing to make the investment because we are in such a rapid point of change that I need to contribute to my own personal development more so than anything else.
Let's get to another question. Yes, maybe in the middle here. We just have 5 minutes, so let's make the question short, and the answer is also short. Yeah.
Hi, Santiago Vallejo from US Bank. So question for Vanessa and Tom. You have this culture of innovation from the venture side startups, which is very dynamic, very fast. And then you have very traditional cultures that have made a business model successful. So as leaders, when you are standing on both worlds at the same time, especially you, Vanessa, with ventures and chief innovation officer, how do you sell to both audiences the benefit of each other's culture so that they can work together?
I don't think it's a very hard sell, actually. I think at this point, there's widespread recognition from leaders and all incumbents that what's happening in the startup space, whether you're talking about fintech or just talking about cybersecurity or data, right, that there's really interesting, important advances that are happening, and they want to be a part of what's happening kind of on the outside of the company. And I think increasingly, startups, this has always been true, but certainly increasingly in the financial services space, are interested in understanding how do they take their innovation, their product, their new idea to much wider distribution, to to a much larger group of potential customers. So it's not a sell. The question is, how do you build the engine to make the conversation productive? But it's actually really easy, I think, to get two people in the room.
Another question from the floor before we run out of time? If not, let me ask you, Tom. We were briefly chatting about this before, and that is the role of design of the workplace and what it conveys in terms of the culture that companies expect. I mean, I was joking about Dilbert when we started this session, but I wasn't really joking, right? I mean, all of us endured a couple of decades in which most corporations thought that sort of the dehumanizing way of putting people in little cubicles was the epitome of corporate efficiency. Maybe there was a time that was the right way to go, but am I right in thinking that thinking is changing, that we have other ways of accommodating flexible workforce and getting the most out of talent, including thinking about different ways that people actually convene?
Yeah, I think we're in an interesting moment right now when we think about what is the workplace needs to be for the employees of the future. And on one end, I would say that we all talk about the notion of the open workspace and how anti-productive that is. And I think the employee of the future, they want tremendous flexibility. I think not as much in schedule, but in how they work and where they work. And one thing that we espouse is we want our employees to come in because that forced collaboration of getting people from many different perspectives to work together is what's going to fuel the innovation in an organization. And if they're all working independently in their own little cubicle and zone, like, God bless us, it's not going to happen. So we set up environments in a way that if you got to work in a scrum room and you got to be able to have 6 people working together from technology, design, and so forth, they're able to work together in that moment. And that's maybe the first 2 hours of the day. The next hour, I got to work alone and be in my own isolated zone where I can work with 1 or 2 other individuals. Provide that. 3, I need to be working in an open environment with a lot of noise and a lot of energy. Give me that when I'm looking for inspiration. So the workspace of the future that we're working on for a lot of our clients, and even at PwC ourselves, is a very flexible space so people can come in and out of their mental modes that they're in throughout the day. And I think that's what, in my mind, workplace flexibility is more about than schedules and working from home and so forth.
Another element of the dehumanizing Dilbert workplace is we traditionally do companies as these top-down command and control organizations where if you're working on something, you're not really in charge of that. You're not really the decision maker. Even if you're making decisions, your decision could be overturned by your manager or the CEO at any time. And I think that the workplaces of the future are going to have a much higher level of empowerment. At Asana, we have a pretty radical level of empowerment that would probably make most traditional corporations uncomfortable, where if you're the designer on some piece of work, even if you're coming to do a design review with me as the head of product, I'll give you lots of strongly worded advice. But if you disagree with me, you're ultimately the person in control of that design. And we have safety mechanisms to ensure that catastrophic things don't happen, but those are actually rarely used. In practice, people are very radically empowered to have autonomy over and full decision making over the thing that they're working on. And that leads to more mistakes for sure, but it also leads to being able to people feeling a lot more invested in their work, caring a lot more about the decisions that they're making, and allows us to hire and retain a much higher caliber of talent because those people, instead of being like, well, if I want control, I guess I'm going to need to start my own startup, can really feel that control at Asana.
I've noticed looking at companies like WeWork and some of the other co-working spaces, looking at their client lists, I noticed a lot of Fortune 500 companies are now members. And I cross-checked some of the cities in which they're members of the particular location. And they're often cities where they already have an office. And so it makes you wonder, why would you pay twice? And of course, it's because people who are coming don't want to go and sit with the cubicles and have, they want a different environment, a different buzz. They're not loners, but that they value a third space that they can go to, which gets to your point about people wanting flexibility in how they work and where they draw their energy and external networks and so on. So I think that's a great area to look at for the future.